Okay, let's now dig further into the idea of what government should and shouldn't be involved in, which is a really major part of the conversation about police departments. We've already talked about calls to abolish or defund the police in light of the protests and the killing of George Floyd. There's a bigger question implicit in that discussion, which is what should governments be involved in and what shouldn't governments be involved in? And this is a question that really tracks political views, because on one side you have extreme small government conservatives and libertarians. They will sometimes go as far as to say roads should be privatized. You can pay the owner to use whichever road you want or look for a different road. Another example would be the privatization of law enforcement, where if you want to be able to call the police, you pay some kind of a membership fee to the law enforcement company that you prefer, Google Cops or Amazon Police or whatever. These are extreme examples, but there are some small government libertarians that believe this stuff. On the extreme other hand, you have truly communist governments, where the government would potentially own all of the industry and be the sole employer. They manufacture the vehicles. The government employs the doctors, owns the hospitals, owns every restaurant, decides what food rations people get and what farmers need to do with the crops that they grow. These are two extremes. We have no examples of success in the modern world for either of the two extremes, because like with most things, the devil is in the details. This is gray area. So let's dig into it. My starting point as a social democrat is that there are many things government should be doing instead of private industry, but we should be able to articulate a compelling reason for why the government should be involved instead of private industry. So in other words, government should not be the only provider of a good or service unless there is a specific case about why they should be. One of the most important things that governments should be doing in industries where they are not participating is setting the ground rules, which I call regulation. I don't need government providing, for example, car insurance, but I do want government saying to private businesses, if you want to be in the market of offering car insurance, here are the rules you have to abide by. Similarly, I don't want the government running airlines and making the airplanes, but I do want government heavily involved in saying, if you're going to build airplanes, here are the ground rules. If you are going to sell tickets to fly people around, here are the ground rules you need to adhere to. Now, most examples are pretty easy to get agreement on. For example, very few people believe the government should be the sole manufacturer of mobile phones. And we've got plenty of companies, Samsung, Apple, and others that are innovating in that space and making mobile phones, and that's fine. But we'll get back to mobile phones because there are complexities that come in when you introduce externalities which justify the role of government. Now, on the other hand, most people do believe that government should be responsible for police departments and law enforcement, missile defense, defending the country from foreign attackers, stopping terrorism, etc. And as I mentioned in the other segment, you might think that it's a good idea to leave something like human trafficking to nonprofits and community groups. But this is stuff with such a massive legal infrastructure, and it's so big and wide ranging. I do want a properly functioning government law enforcement apparatus to be dealing with something like human trafficking correctly. So the small government versus big government ideas are very often theoretical. They're about principles, but you've got to do way more work to really figure out how our economy should be organized. Healthcare is something. I want government more involved in healthcare. There are examples from all over the world of government being involved in healthcare and the healthcare being better. Healthcare is an exception, as I mentioned. We need a compelling reason to say this should be pulled out of for-profit markets. When we're talking about people's health, I don't believe at a moral level that that should be something subject to the whims of companies looking to make profits. So as a social democrat, I would say healthcare meets the requirement to be pulled out of for-profit market-based. And then you've got gray area. So like, I don't need the government running all the hospitals or employing all the doctors necessarily, but maybe I just want them being the insurance company, negotiating prices, establishing ground rules. Okay, that's something that I would want. Let me give you another gray area. I want the government doing lots of infrastructure spending. I want them improving our airports and our roads and our bridges. I don't need the government running the construction companies or being the construction company and buying the bulldozers and the skid steers and doing it all themselves. I'm fine with government hiring private industry to do the actual infrastructure work. The problem is when the process of hiring private industry becomes a crony capitalist snow job where the jobs are given to the president's friends. So I'm a social democrat. I do think that markets, when they actually are well regulated and function fairly, direct resources where they are most useful from a utility point of view. And sometimes we have to say this area of society should not be subjected to the market calculation of where the most utility is derived, health being one of those examples. I don't believe for a second this BS that we hear about. Industries have incentives to regulate themselves. Government doesn't need to regulate because if the business does something bad, the PR will be terrible. News reports about them will make them lose money. Just doesn't work. Doesn't work. Consider a company that makes cars and they pollute and harm some town that's downwind and people in that town get way more lung cancer over the 20 years after the cars have been manufactured. That's an externality. Now, you could say, well, the bad PR of people hearing about that is going to make fewer people buy that company's cars. And so the company has an incentive not to pollute in order to keep selling more cars and avoid the bad PR. Just doesn't happen. These externalities are only often loosely assignable to a specific action by a company. Oftentimes, even if the company gets sued, it is cheaper to pollute and kill a bunch of people. And every once in a while, you just pay some civil lawsuit. So the point here is the externalities are not properly dealt with by markets, and that is the role of government regulation. So the takeaway is, I want most areas of life operating in well-regulated markets with the profits properly taxed to ensure that everyone has a decent standard of living. I want industry to operate in a market with enough safeguards and infrastructure, and it is not to their advantage to hurt people in order to earn the profits that they are earning. That's why the regulation has to be strict enough. And in some cases, I actually want the government participating in the market rather than just regulating it. Healthcare being an exception, an example of that. So this stuff is complex. The principles people who talk about liberty and non-aggression, and they just want to talk abstractly, they often don't want to do or aren't able to do the difficult work of really digging into the specifics, and you have to do it in order to really get anywhere on this stuff. We're going to continue talking about this on the David Pakman Show Instagram page, @David Pakman Show. Make sure you're following us there.